Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Kris. This is Kings and Generals. Sherman marches on Atlanta, Grant's 1864 strategy. So, before we get started, if you can click that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you like the content, click on the thanks button if you want to donate to the channel. Got a couple more I got to do to get current. This is going to be broken down again into sorry, I read this is only 18 minutes. No, you just read that wrong, dummy. All right, so maybe about 14 minutes. All right, we'll break it into two videos. Sorry, not sorry. Has to be done. All right, let's get into it.
By 1864, the Confederacy was clearly dying. Losing Chattanooga had cut the southern capital of Richmond off from everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. Its armies were ragged, hungry, and desertion was rising. The economy was collapsing, and civilians were starving. However, the only thing that mattered was the US presidential election on November 8th. If the South kept fighting and Abraham Lincoln wasn't re-elected, then a diplomatic settlement was still possible. However, William Tecumseh Sherman had no intention of leaving the war up to the voters. Welcome to our latest video on the American Civil War, in which we will cover the Union Army's decisive invasion of Georgia and Sherman's infamous and destructive march to the sea. Every week we release 3 new experiments description. Ulysses Simpson Grant's promotion to the Military Division of the Mississippi Command vacated command of the Army of the Tennessee. Sherman took over, but only had his 15th Corps for the Chattanooga campaign. Following the victory, he marched north to relieve Knoxville. This proved unnecessary, as Longstreet lifted the siege immediately after hearing the news from Chattanooga. Sherman finally returned to Vicksburg to formally take command of his army in January. Meanwhile, Grant intended to take the department's armies to Atlanta. While technically outside his department, Atlanta wasn't in anyone else's jurisdiction. Moreover, Lincoln never objected to vigorous prosecution of the war, and would probably be in favor of a campaign on the wealthy southern city. However, before the Union armies could march on Atlanta, their rear needed to be secured. After Jackson was destroyed during the Vicksburg campaign, the Mississippi state government relocated to Meridian, which housed an arsenal and all the surviving regional railway links. Meridian was defended by 10,000 troops near Morton under Leonidas Polk. The incompetent Polk wasn't a threat, but Sherman needed practice commanding an army. Sherman marched from Vicksburg on February 3, 1864, with 20,000 men. He simultaneously ordered his 7,000 cavalry to advance from Memphis, chase Nathan Forrest's cavalry off, then rendezvous with Sherman in Meridian. His remaining troops feinted in several directions, while his naval transports maneuvered near Mobile to draw attention away from Meridian. These deceptions successfully convinced Polk that Sherman's target was Mobile. Rather than hold Morton, he pulled back to Meridian, intending to hit Sherman's rear once he turned towards Mobile. Consequently, he was shocked when Sherman came after him and fled into Alabama without a fight. Although Forrest's aggressive attack drove off the superior Union cavalry, attacks on the other feints failed. Consequently, Sherman occupied Meridian unopposed on February 14th. After destroying everything of military value and freeing Union prisoners, Sherman marched back to Vicksburg on February 20th, where an unexpected promotion was awaiting. Grant had been informed that he'd soon be made General-in-Chief and promoted to Lieutenant General, the US Army's first since George Washington. He'd therefore need to leave the West for the East. Accordingly, he wanted his friend to bring his army to Chattanooga, then take over the Western Department. When Grant formally received his promotion on March 9, 1864, President Lincoln was in a particularly depressive mood. Certain that he'd lose re-election, he wanted Grant to either win the war outright before November, thereby ensuring his re-election, or ensure that it could be won before a peace candidate took office in March. Grant complied with his signature strategic directness. At this late stage,
So, I think if the election were held in March of 1864. Maybe Lincoln has issues. With it being November, he had such a landslide victory. My opinion is he had a better grip on the election than I think he believed. When it gets talked about now, I think it gets put in a more precarious situation than I think it probably was. I'm not 100% sure. That's more opinion. I think there was a better chance of beating him earlier in the year than there was later in the year. But even then, I still think he wins. I just don't think it's as big of a landslide as it was. I think he still had it. Could be wrong. You know, things could change. Evidence could change. I could be wrong on what I'm remembering and stuff like that. I just think I think he had it more in the bag than he knew. And even if, say, McClellan, let's say McClellan wins. If we're talking about, as he says, Lincoln says he wanted to get in a better position for March of 1865. Well, the war pretty much ended early April. I think if McClellan gets in March of 1865, I don't necessarily know if he pulls the reins back completely and starts to negotiate. I think he steps in and sees the writing on the wall. Grant's getting it done. Sherman's getting it done. There's a lot of stuff that's happening. Even though the party, was it the Democratic Party, wanted peace, I think McClellan is more likely to push to see it through because they're so close. Why give up now? You know, that's also my opinion. What do I know on that?
In the war, the only strategic unconquered Confederate territories were the cities of Mobile, Richmond, and Atlanta. If those cities were taken, then the Confederacy would eventually wither and die. However, destroying the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee would win the war outright. Therefore, George Meade and the Army of the Potomac would engage Robert E. Lee, using Richmond to pin him in place and destroy him. Sherman would do the same to the Army of Tennessee by launching an assault on Atlanta. Meanwhile, all other commands would launch supplemental attacks to divert and overwhelm Confederate resources. Each department had discretion for how to complete its objectives, but all movements had to begin between May 1st and 14th. Grant would finally launch the simultaneous offensive McClellan talked up back in 1861.
And the one thing you think about is McClellan thought of the plan. What if he would have executed it? Would we still be fighting in 1864? Because by the time Grant took over to the war end was it a year? March, April, so 13 months? I mean, I'm not saying we steamroll the Confederates in a 13-month span. If he does this, and let's say the start of the year 1862, war's not over mid-1863. But if he had done the plan, I take that back. No, I'm not trying to shit on McClellan, but McClellan might have had a great plan that Grant was using. McClellan's not the guy that would have succeeded in instituting that plan. You need someone like Grant. There was a saying, Ken Burns talked about it. By the way, Ken Burns has a series coming out about the Revolutionary War. I think it drops Sunday, November 16th. Unrelated to this, but it's a Ken Burns series, so I'm plugging it. I think that I'm sorry, Ken Burns got sidetracked. Ken Burns said there was a quote from Lincoln, and it was a scary quote, and Lincoln said something to the effect of, "We can win the war once everyone realizes it's a numbers game." And basically, the North had more numbers. Unfortunate as it is, and it's war, it's a dirty game. It's not a game, but it's a dirty game. We have more numbers. We have more people to, I hate to say sacrifice, but we have more people to lose in a sacrificial way by throwing them at the enemy. And unfortunately, we're going to have to do that. Now, that Lincoln's quote was, if we just realize we have the numbers, or we have better numbers, something to that effect. Don't quote me on his quote, but that's pretty much what it is. And it's, you think how many people could have been saved, North and South, if you hurry the war up in that aspect. But again, how many more could have been lost if McClellan didn't retreat and just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing? Yeah. I'm going to shut up now. I'm sorry.
Grant provided Sherman with his plans for capturing Atlanta.
What I'm saying is sometimes I talk myself out of a position, and then I don't know where I'm going. I just spiral.
After which the two were in constant telegraph contact to coordinate their efforts. Grant took Burnside and the 9th Corps back east. Hooker and his troops, having been reorganized into the 20th Corps, would stay behind. Sherman would have 7 infantry corps and 4 cavalry divisions across 3 armies to conquer Atlanta. The only viable supply line for both sides through the mountains of northern Georgia was the Western and Atlantic Railroad. Advancing along these routes meant contending with Confederate defenses in the front, and cavalry raids against the rail network back to the supply hub in Nashville. Because of these perils, Grant had envisioned a swift confrontation with the Army of Tennessee in northern Georgia from multiple fronts as quickly as possible. However, Sherman knew that he'd have difficulty replacing losses due to his long and easily disrupted supply lines. Therefore, he decided to take a page out of Rosecrans's book. Rather than fight directly, Sherman would maneuver his enemy into defeat. While there was only one railway through the mountains, the numerous roads, of highly variable quality, meant that a route past an enemy always existed. Therefore, he'd use his 3 armies to pin down, flank, and envelop his opponent as he inexorably marched to Atlanta. The Confederate general opposing Sherman's advance was Joseph Johnston. Ever since taking direct command from Braxton Bragg in December, Johnston had been working tirelessly to put the broken Army of Tennessee back together, and had mostly succeeded. While morale never recovered to pre-Chickamauga levels, he had restored his 40,000 soldiers' will to fight, and found them the best weapons and food available. Polk joined him in late March, and another 15,000 would arrive during May from other Alabama garrisons. With these weary but able soldiers, Johnston had to find a way to halt Sherman's 120,000-strong departmental juggernaut. Richmond wanted Johnston to fight like Lee and take the offensive against Sherman, but Johnston refused. He knew his generals weren't capable of executing such deceptive, complicated...
Sorry, I just want to read this. Jefferson Davis adamantly believed that Sherman's field army was only 60,000 strong, despite Confederate cavalry repeatedly reporting over 100,000 Federals several times. Johnson subsequently ignored Davis, which escalated existing tensions between the two. Johnson was never going to put himself... This is what I liked about Johnston, whether he's a Confederate or a Union. Johnson was never going to put his men in a situation where they were going to be outnumbered or in a bad position or any. He wanted the advantage. Otherwise, it wasn't worth it. Now, I understand sometimes you just have to hunker down and fight. I get it. But if that's your guy and he's not going to put you in a position to just sacrifice you, you tell me you wouldn't love that man? I love the idea of it. Because I know that he cares about me. And if we're going into a battle, it's because he feels the scales are tipped into our favor. And I am going to fight for that man. Because I know that he's fighting for me by not putting me in bad situations. I like Johnston.
And bold offensive maneuvers. Even if they could, Sherman was too tenacious to retreat, too smart to be fooled, and had too many troops to destroy. Moreover, Johnston couldn't replace his losses, making open battle exceedingly risky. However, northern Georgia was a natural fortress, so Johnston didn't have to defeat Sherman outright to win the campaign. Johnston was aware of northern war weariness, and that the peace Democrats were gaining strength. If he could deny Sherman a significant victory before November 8th, the ballot box could save the Confederacy. Therefore, he would play for time. To that end, Johnston built a series of fortifications between Chickamauga Creek and Atlanta, planning to hold each position as long as possible before falling back. The hope was that Sherman would assault his positions, grinding his armies to death. If not, between natural attrition and constant skirmishing, he would bleed Sherman dry. To accelerate the process, Johnston identified a number of sites where Sherman's columns would naturally isolate themselves and planned ambushes. As the Union Army descended upon Georgia, Johnston's inferior Confederate defense force was bolstered by some unusual aid. The 3-year contracts of the Union Army's veteran 1861 volunteers were starting to expire. The Confederate Congress had indefinitely extended all Confederate enlistments, which the US Congress had not. This meant that Sherman's best men were trickling away. While over half would be returning after furloughs and new recruits would make up the lost numbers, Sherman's department would have problems with total manpower and soldier quality between June and September. There was also bound to be organizational chaos from units leaving and being replaced. While a major inconvenience, Johnston's manpower deficiencies prevented him from exploiting Sherman's weakness. Sherman marched from Chattanooga on May 3rd. Johnston's skirmishers and Joseph Wheeler's cavalry picked at Sherman constantly until he reached Johnston's first line, Rocky Face Ridge, on May 7th. Rather than attack, Sherman ordered Thomas and Schofield to demonstrate against Dug and Mill Creek gaps, while McPherson snuck through Snake Creek Gap to take Resaca by surprise, trapping Johnston. McPherson successfully swung around the Confederate left, only to find that Resaca was Johnston's first fallback position and was already garrisoned. Rather than assault an unknown position, McPherson pulled back into the gap and alerted Sherman, who disengaged the other armies and marched south on May 10th. Johnston detected Sherman's movement on May 11th and pulled back to Resaca the following day. He had expected Sherman to get past him, but not this quickly. Still, this is what he had prepared for, and, helped by Wheeler's delaying tactics, he was in position before Sherman arrived. To encourage Sherman to charge his fortifications, Johnston ordered the supply wagons to continue south to the Oostenaula River, as if the army was retreating. Sherman believed the ruse, but didn't act as Johnston expected. Instead, he ordered his cavalry to use pontoon bridges to get behind Johnston and cut the railroad at Rome. 2 corps would engage what Sherman thought was Johnston's right flank to pin him down, while the rest of the army moved into position and set the trap, and the cavalry cut off Johnston's escape. The operation went ahead at 1100 on May 14th, but the infantry quickly discovered they were attacking the center of Johnston's line, not the flank. The surprise encounter was followed by a determined attack, which took some forward position.
Hood was left with the Army of Tennessee after Chickamauga to recover from losing his leg. He stayed to be a corps commander rather than a division commander under Longstreet. All right.
But was halted by 1500. At 1600, Johnston ordered Hood's corps to counterattack the 4th Corps' exposed left flank. The initial attack pushed through startled defenders until double canister fire and reinforcements repelled it. Limited fighting resumed mid-morning along the whole line on May 15th, with no side gaining any advantage until 1630, when the defenders of Lay's Ferry moved to attack supposedly exposed Federals, just as the Federal cavalry arrived and crossed. His supply and retreat line exposed, Johnston withdrew during the night towards Adairsville, having inflicted more casualties than he took. Constant skirmishing resumed as Johnston fell back. Sherman was advancing on too broad a front to hold Adairsville, so Johnston retreated again. The Confederate general expected Sherman to divide his forces between the Kingston and Cassville roads, so he prepared an ambush. Hardee's corps remained in Kingston, while the other corps moved to Cassville. When Sherman attacked Kingston, the units on his left flank would be isolated and exposed, letting Polk and Hood destroy them as they moved to Cassville. Sherman took the bait, sending all but 2 corps against Hardee. However, he was not punished because Hood failed Johnston. Indeed, Hood had been supposed to ambush the column while Polk pinned it on May 19th. Instead, he had panicked after receiving reports of Federals behind him. It was actually a cavalry patrol, but he still retreated to rejoin Polk. Johnston recognized that the opportunity had passed. Once Hardee rejoined him, he retreated into Allatoona Pass. Johnston's position was far too strong to assault, so Sherman looked for alternatives. The road through Dallas to Marietta looked promising, so Sherman prepared to leave his supply line and flank Johnston along that route. Taking 20 days of supplies, Sherman moved out on May 23rd. However, Wheeler was watching and alerted Johnston, who had anticipated such a move by garrisoning Dallas. Once certain this wasn't a feint, Johnston moved his whole army to block Sherman. Hardee and Polk were in position and had entrenched themselves before Hooker's corps arrived on May 25th. After spending the afternoon scouting, Hooker assaulted the Southerners at New Hope Church around 1700. He was bloodily repulsed after 3 hours of fighting in a thunderstorm. Fueled by his hatred for Hooker, Sherman unfairly chastised his subordinate for delaying the attack, not realizing Johnston had arrived the day before. With his main route blocked, Sherman tried to flank the Confederate right. Ordering Hooker to pin the Confederate center with skirmishing, he sent Howard's corps to Pickett's Mill and had McPherson's army occupy Dallas. On May 27th, Howard was supposed to send his whole corps against Cleburne's lone division, but instead only attacked with 1 brigade, which was badly mauled. Bad intelligence led Johnston to launch a failed attack on Dallas on May 28th. Skirmishing continued along the entire line until June 1st, when Sherman...
Sorry, I just want to read this. Polk's death dealt a strong blow to Confederate public morale, but was a relief to Johnston, the former lionized, fighting Bishop, while the latter had to deal with his borderline incompetence and argumentative personality. Yeah, Polk was a bit of a headache. So, yeah, you don't want the guy to die so that you can feel like, oh, thank God. But at the same time, I don't think, Johnston and Davis weren't getting along. So Davis wasn't going to really go with anything that Johnston said, like, hey, I don't want this guy. Too bad. Deal with him. So I guess your best option is, unfortunately, he gets killed.
Sherman's cavalry found Allatoona Pass undefended. Sherman then shifted left, and by June 3rd, Thomas and Schofield's armies were through. Johnston detected the move and withdrew to the defenses around Marietta.
I was going to talk and I mute myself. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop there for part 1. We'll be back with part 2. A lot of the little nitpicky details of the battles I don't know of, so I'm not really saying much. But if I know something, I try to share it. If I don't, I don't. All right, so we're going to end it here. And until part 2, have a good day, have a good night.